The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 13. Shovel and Shear. A Thursday evening in late September, 1995. Peter was tired, hot and sweaty. He wanted a cold shandy, a shower, and a kip, in that order. Unfortunately for him, his time was not his own.
"Just a bit further, Wormtail. I'm sure we'll find it soon."
It had been the Dark Lord's command that the bones of his Muggle father needed to be properly exhumed, rather than summoned by magic. He had some long and rambling explanation as to why this was, something about tainting the spirit of magic with the filthiness of Muggle biological matter, but Peter had given up listening to the explanation a long time ago. The short of it was that Peter was standing with a shovel 4 feet below the surface of the ground, wearing a baby carrier backpack on his back, which held the world's ugliest and scariest-looking baby. And he was digging. And digging. And digging. They had started at sundown, hoping not to be noticed by the villagers of Little Hangleton. Peter had cast a notice-me-not charm, but he wasn't sure if it was strong enough. More than one curious stray cat had stopped to watch his progress. Cats made him nervous. Every time one arrived, he would shoo it away with his shovel. The cats would hiss and swipe at the shovel, move back a foot or two, then stop and turn brazenly, settling themselves to watch once more. Peter shovelled out yet another spadeful of dirt, and dug the blade back in, stepping on the edge of it so that it might bite further into the earth. It hit something solid.
"That's it, Wormtail! You've found it!"
Peter allowed himself only a moment to rest on the handle of the shovel before resuming. Yes, he had found it, but he still needed to uncover it. 4 hours later, he staggered into the kitchen of the Riddle house, lurching achefully towards the sink. He dropped the baby carrier backpack as gently as he could. He was deeply tired, long past the desire for the shandy and the shower. He cupped his hands under the sink tap and gulped the sweet, almost mossy-flavoured water from the bowl formed by his dirty palms. When his stomach was swollen and gurgling with the water, he stopped drinking, turning off the water tap, and slumped down to his knees on the floor. He eyed the square yellow tiles lovingly. Here looked as good a place as any to rest his head. He lay face down on the floor, the cool tiles caressing his cheek like a lover's hand. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes was the skittering, atrocious baby urchin propelling itself across the floor. It half-crawled, half-dragged itself from the room towards its bed.
"Well done, Wormtail. Rest." The Rat-man would need a few hours of sleep. The Dark Lord did not begrudge him that, even though he was impatient. It was September already, and time was wasting away. He crawled back to the side of a large 4-poster bed that he shared with Nagini. She was coiled loosely upon the bed, the perfect size for him to nest in the midst of her coils. He climbed gratefully against her, settling against her cool, dry skin. Her head raised slightly, and one eye opened to take him in. "I've missed you," her eye seemed to say. Her forked tongue darted out, licking a bit of dirt away from his shoulder. He closed his eyes and let her. When she was satisfied that he was clean, she rested her head against his stomach and slept again. There would be time for the spell, tomorrow perhaps. For now, the 3 inhabitants of the Riddle house slumbered peacefully. "Get up!" The time for rest was over. He was ready to claim his body again. He pushed his wand into Wormtail's neck. Well, it wasn't his wand, not exactly. As they had slithered northward on their return to England from Albania, he and Nagini had passed through several lands. First were several smaller countries that used to not be individual countries at all. Next, a corner of Italy, then Switzerland. Here they turned northwards and west, cutting a swath across France. All of their movements were done at night. They slept during the day. As they slithered, Nagini would occasionally feel talkative and share a bit of what she had learned in her time alone. There had been more wars, of course, hence the reason for multiple countries, rather than just the one of Yugoslavia. America had elected an actor as its leader, and he had somehow convinced almost the entirety of Eastern and Western Europe to be civil to each other. How quaint. Now they had arrived at a town in France, where they would take something that Nagini called the Channel. It sounded remarkable and vaguely dangerous, until Voldemort realized that it was simply a tunnel under the English Channel. Well, this was a nice bit of innovation. When he returned to power and controlled all manner of magical creatures, this channel would be useful in his bid to take over the European continent for those who could not apparate. He wondered if the American actor had also built a tunnel from England to America. As they passed through the underbelly of the channel, the chunderbelly, Voldemort thought wildly. His eye caught on something lying on the ground. "Go back," he whispered to the faithful Nagini. She turned and slithered back the way they had come. "There, to the left. Here, stop." The snake halted, waiting beside a pile of debris. With a trembling, fledgling hand that barely looked like a hand, Voldemort stretched carefully towards the object. It was perfect, entirely smooth and unblemished. Bold stripes of red and yellow ran down its length, segmenting the stark white of it. As he picked it up, he was pleased to feel the lightness of it. Rather than the heft of a solid twig like a wand, this one was nearly as light as air. He saw upon inspection that the reason for this was that it was filled with air, hollow, open at each end. He waved the object carefully, performing the last spell that he had done, Avada Kedavra. "Yes, this will do wonderfully," until such time as he had his own body and his own wand back. This wand fit well in his hand, worked perfectly for his needs. Nagini whispered a name, an origin, for the spectacular wand in his hand. He smiled to himself. Of course, it was a stalwart Scottish name, no doubt from a rich, ancient herald filled with noble ancestry. Perhaps when he restyled himself in a few years he would adopt this name as his own, leaving behind all traces of Riddle and Gaunt. As it was, he had had a bugger of a time coming up with Lord Voldemort. 13-year-old him was adamant that Tom Marvolo Riddle had to have an anagram suitable for a powerful dark overlord. It had taken him the better part of a year to come up with the best option. Immortal Dove Lord was immediately rejected. He had no desire to use the dove as his symbol. Immortal Voted Lord also sounded strange. Rival Moulded Motor sounded vaguely mechanical and was rejected. Lord Mollard Vomit was amusing to his 13-year-old self, but he knew it would ultimately send the wrong message. What was he? A dentist? Ones that he had considered briefly but rejected were immortal odd lover, or immortal love rod, but he did not want to include any references to love in his new name. It just didn't offer the kind of power and fearsome awe that he wanted to project. And Love Rod just sounded weird. I am Lord Voldemort was by far the best option. And it was time for Lord Voldemort's return. Peter wasn't moving. Voldemort pushed the wand in harder. Into the plump, bald man began to stir.
Peter cracked one eye and flinched. The creepy little creature, formerly known as Voldemort, was back, barely 3 hours after he'd left Peter to die here on this kitchen floor. Voldemort was pushing the McDonald's straw into his neck. The Dark Lord was very protective of this straw, and wielded it imperiously, as though it were a wand or a scepter. It would have been amusing, except for the nightmarishly haunting appearance of the man in his current state. Peter pushed himself up first to his hands and knees, then to his feet. Apparently it was time for the magic. He had been dreading it, but on the other hand, well, at least he had the other hand, he thought. He picked up Voldemort and grabbed the supplies that he'd been amassing for the last few weeks. Several varieties of herbs stolen from neighbors' flower pots. Dandelion weeds from the garden. Unicorn blood from a wizarding apothecary. 2 mandrake plants, which had been maturing in the kitchen windowsill, along with earmuffs for them both. Black pepper from the Muggle grocer. Venom extracted from Nagini earlier that week. The blood of the enemy, forcibly taken from Aberforth. The bone of the father, unknowingly given from the grave Peter had just dug up. And a knife, for the willing sacrifice. They made their way to the downstairs toilet, where the bathtub had been washed in preparation for this moment. Peter turned on the hot water tap in the tub, waiting until the basin was about 1/3 full. He tested the water's temperature before reaching for his master. He placed the creature thing inside the water gently, then began adding the ingredients, stirring meticulously after each addition. Finally, it was time for the final 3 ingredients. He poured the blood in and said the incantation. The water, which had been a dull grey, turned red. He added the bone, including the incantation as he did so, and the water turned blue. He picked up the knife in his left hand, taking several fast breaths in an effort to steady himself. "Do it!" Voldemort commanded, and Peter shut his eyes tight, pressing the blade to his own right forearm as hard as he could. In a minute it was over. The water turned white and began frothing and bubbling. Peter looked away, crouched to the ground, consumed in his own acute pain and grief. He gathered up a swath of robe and wrapped it around the stump of his hand. The ache in his arm was intense, but he knew it would pass. Instead, he was left with the misery of knowing that, from now on, he would never be able to aim his stream of pee and scratch himself at the same time. He would never start a round of applause, or play the cymbals again. And he would have to learn to write and cast spells with his left hand. The bubbling bathtub was reaching a frothing point, the mist above it beginning to dissipate. From its depths, a shadow began to emerge, which solidified into a figure. The man began to stand in the center of the bathtub. No longer the mottled, angry red of newly formed skin. Now Voldemort's pallor was the dry grey of a snake, nearing its shed. He had no nose. Apparently they had missed an ingredient. The feather of a toucan, perhaps. Peter thought wildly and tried not to laugh, as his body entered shock. Voldemort's mouth was a straight, colourless gash, and he had no hair.
but his eyes. Peter looked at them once, and it was enough. He didn't wish to do it again. They glowed red, the blistering red of a Muggle fire engine. A warning. He was back. He felt glorious. The whimpering, crying man on the ground cowered before him, in his rightful place at last. "Wormtail," he said, "robe me." Wormtail pushed himself up from the ground gracelessly, overbalancing on his left side. He took a long wizard's robe from a hook on the back of the door, trying to hold it in a way that would not get his blood on it. Awkwardly, he held it out for the taller man to put on. "Your arm, Wormtail," Voldemort said. Suddenly, Peter was overcome with relief. Voldemort had mentioned it vaguely, of course, that with his renewed powers he would provide Peter with an acceptable substitute. But in his past experiences, the Dark Lord had not been one to appease his inferiors so quickly. In gratitude, he held out his bloodied stump. "Your other arm, Wormtail." Oh, well, that was quite different. Voldemort extended a long, pale finger and pressed it firmly upon the dark mark on Peter's arm. The mark had begun to change months ago, likely correlating to the Dark Lord's awakening and increased strength. Voldemort looked at Peter. Peter looked at the floor. "We should move into the living room," Voldemort said. "I feel that the toilet won't be large enough to hold us all." Peter nodded grimly and reached with his left hand into the bathtub to pull the chain for the drain stopper. Lucius awoke from a post-dinner nap on the sofa in his study. The mark on his arm, which had been changing and itching for months, was inflamed, an angry, burning red. A beacon. He sat up quickly in fear. The thing that he had been dreading. It was happening, then. The time had come. Voldemort had returned. Lucius was afraid of the wrath of his former master. Did Voldemort know what had happened? Who had divulged what to Ministry officials? Was he going to be facing the gallows, or would he be received with open arms? And would those open arms wield a wand bent on vengeance? Then, like a shelter in a hailstorm, he remembered his trump card. Lucius, above all others, had been welcoming to Voldemort's most trusted secret agent. He had opened his home to him, had offered his son's protection for that man's daughter. Richard was his ticket to being in Voldemort's good graces again. He stood and disapparated. Chapter 14. Disapparition and Danger. Still one Thursday evening in late September, 1995. When he arrived in the Muggle living room, Lucius found Richard on the sofa in his pants and an A-shirt, feet propped up on an ottoman, his hand digging in a bag of crisps. Lucius, what are you doing here?" "Why aren't you dressed? We need to go as quickly as possible."
Sorry. Where are we going again?" Richard worried that he'd made plans with Lucius and forgotten. But no, the only plan he had made for this evening was to watch the Tottenham Spurs beat down Man U.
"Did your mark not burn?"
Lucius held up his arm. "Sorry, what?"
"Never mind. Just get dressed. We need to go. Quickly, he is waiting."
Geez, I just poured a Newcastle. Linda's out for the night with her canasta club. Wouldn't you rather sit and watch the match instead?"
Lucius's eyes flitted across to the colourful rectangular box that moved with tiny little athletes in colourful kits. He had seen a football match once, having flown over one at night and stopped to watch. Yes, he very much would like to come back and watch sometime. But tonight was not that night. "We have to go." Richard huffed a sigh.
Well, okie dokie. Give me a few minutes." 3 minutes later, he had put back on his dress trousers from work and a dark blue Oxford shirt. He rejoined Lucius, who, in spite of his terror, had indeed gotten sucked into watching the football match. "Who's winning?" "The team calling themselves the Spurs. Scored 1 minute ago," Lucius answered, dusting off the crisp dust from his fingers. "Damn, I missed it. Hopefully we're back before the evening report." Lucius only looked at Richard sternly. He tilted his head to the side, indicating that the man should stand next to him. Lucius did not say anything. "Hopefully we come back," he thought to himself, as he grabbed Richard's arm and disapparated. Richard's stomach was finally settling from their sudden disappearance from his living room and reappearance in this creepy place. He spent several minutes with his lips clamped together, willing himself not to vomit. He looked around a bit to take in his surroundings. It was still dark and rainy, based on the sliver of outdoors he could make out from a nearby window. The room was sparsely furnished with outdated but ornate furniture. The room at this new place was crowded with several of Lucius's friends that Richard had met years before at the reception for them. He nodded hello to the man that he remembered as Not. There was Perkinson, and the man named Antonin or Antonio he couldn't remember. Richard Granger never forgot a face, but he was shite for names. Rather than milling about and talking, however, everyone stood in a loose circle, extremely quiet. There were a couple of faces he couldn't quite place. However, it had been a large reception. Perhaps he hadn't been introduced to everyone there. He nodded hello to a short, balding man with prominent buck teeth. The man looked quite pale and was shivering as he held one arm close to his chest. He didn't look well, now that Richard looked at him properly. Then another man that he didn't recognize started to speak, and the small bit of noise in the room ceased immediately.
"I am pleased that you are here, that you still answer my call. You are my most faithful servants. There are some who would not or could not come. Those who refused will be dealt with."
Richard's brow furrowed. What was this guy talking about? He couldn't see the man very well, seeing as they stood in a circle, and the man speaking was two to his right, only visible in profile. No one else seemed to want to look at him. In unfamiliar situations, Richard had learned to generally follow the lead of the people around him. The man between them, a large, heavy-set man whose name eluded Richard at the moment, partially blocked his view. From the corner of his eye he could see that the speaking man looked rather washed out, as though he spent a lot of time indoors, away from the sun. Additionally, he had a very large overbite, Richard could tell from his profile. It probably should have been corrected by orthodontics when he was younger. The dentist who could never leave work at work thought to himself. Who was this man? Had they met at Malfoy Manor? They must have. Everyone else seemed to know him well. Now the man was walking slowly, laboriously, as though his legs did not know how to work properly. He walked to his right first, turning his back to Richard, Lucius, and the large man on Richard's right. As he passed the men, he offered each of them a murmured comment, a small nod in return for their much more exaggerated bow. Next to him, Lucius appeared to be trying not to hyperventilate. Was he afraid of this man? How very odd. Why had they come here, if Lucius didn't want to be here? As the man turned around the circle, greeting the people there, Richard took in his odd clothing choices. The robe looked to be too small, showing far too much leg and bare feet. Sticking out of a breast pocket was what was unmistakably a straw from a McDonald's restaurant. Wizards really were a strange lot, Richard thought. When the man reached Lucius, Lucius performed the necessary bowing and scraping, murmuring quietly to the grey-faced man.
"Lucius, so happy to know that you have seen the error of your ways."
And with this, he turned to Richard. Their eyes met. Richard was shocked to see that the eyes were a bright red. Thankfully, years of military training, plus the nightmare dental situations of a fair few of his patients, meant that Richard's features never changed.
"Who are you?"
the man said to him. Richard Granger. Pleasure to see you again," Richard said confidently, warmly. He had finally decided that this man who knew everyone here must have been at the reception, only he missed introducing himself to the man.
"Yes,"
the unusual-looking man said. Oh. Richard had been so focused on his recessed jawline and overbite that he hadn't noticed the man's lack of a nose. It was a shame how some people got so wrapped up in achieving a certain look through plastic surgery. This man looked as though his surgeon had literally cut off his nose to spite his face. "You might recall, Richard, from some of your more secret missions over the years, my lord," Lucius whispered quietly between the odd-looking man and Richard struggled not to react. My lord. Lord. This man. He was that guy. Surely not. Did Lucius bring him to a home in the middle of nowhere to meet a dark wizard hell-bent on world domination? The red-eyed man. Voldemort, his memory supplied from the conversations with his daughter, looked shrewdly at Richard, narrowing his eyes. Richard racked his brain, trying to find a way out of this situation. His military training kicked in. When in doubt, bluff. Yes, the secret missions. There were those in the north, and in London." Voldemort looked confused. His eyes contracted oddly, and suddenly it all clicked together for Richard. What seemed so off about him? The pale, clammy skin, the unsteady gait, the strained, warbling voice, the bloodshot eyes. The man was suffering from addiction withdrawal, clearly. Richard wasn't sure how long he had been using, but it seemed obvious to him now. Richard's mind was doing quick calculations. This man had disappeared sometime in the early 1980s. Based on the little he had read and things that Hermione had mentioned to him, Voldemort had been born in the 1920s. There was one drug that was the gold standard of pain relief, and was heavily in use in those intervening years. It was a gamble, but when the stakes were high, Richard had been known to gamble. "Perhaps you don't quite remember me? Morphine?" The lean but muscular man gave Voldemort an easy smile. "Perhaps you don't quite remember me? Morphin?"
Voldemort staggered backwards. It was a name he had not heard in a number of years, and yet the name was a linchpin, a touchstone that connected together so many actions and deeds that had followed. "Morphin! You're his son?"
Yes," the man said haltingly. Then he nodded, as if to himself. "Morphin's son."
"Did he... what did he tell you?"
"Enough."
This man, Granger, he had called himself, gave him a hard look. Voldemort nodded. He stepped back into his original spot in the circle, ignoring Crabbe entirely. "I am pleased to find everyone here. I trust that you will continue to answer my call when it comes. Tell no one what has happened here. Tell no one what you saw. All will be revealed when the moment is right." He looked around the room, lost for a moment, then spotted the one he sought. "Come, Wormtail!" He pointed at the rat man, who limped quickly to his side. Putting one hand on the shorter wizard's shoulder, he dragged himself from the room. The men all stood there a moment in surprise, their eyes shifting to each other in confusion. Were they dismissed? Was that it? Voldemort had disappeared for almost 15 years, then showed up out of nowhere, called them, and then dismissed them 30 minutes later. How odd. "Come, Wormtail," Voldemort said, his unsteady gait carrying him from the room. He opened a door to the side of the dining room and went in. From inside the room came the unmistakable sound of a snake's hiss. Those closest to the room had the best view, and shuddered as they glanced inside. The door closed, and they were left alone. "Are we dismissed?" Crabbe asked Richard and Lucius. "Did you see that snake?" Roll asked Jugson. Jugson grimaced and nodded. There were several cracks of noise as some of the men disappeared. Richard gave Lucius a calculating look. "Back to my house?" he asked the blonde wizard. Lucius nodded without a word, and held out his arm. Within seconds, they were standing back in the Grangers' living room. Richard's stomach protested violently, but to his credit, everything stayed inside. Lucius gave him an appraising look. "Who is Morphin?" "Well, until tonight, I thought they were a group of crime-fighting teenagers with a catchy theme song and matching jumpsuits." "Granger, you always speak in riddles. What are you talking about? You spoke with him. He said you were Morphin's son." Richard knew when to play things close to the vest. Lucius had no idea what was going on, but he knew more than Richard did. Richard needed to level the playing field, and that meant withholding information until it was time to share. "Morphin is between me and Voldemort. It doesn't concern you. Why did you take me there tonight?" "Why?" Lucius stared beseechingly. "Because we were summoned. Did you not feel your mark burn?" He thrust his left arm towards Richard and pulled up his sleeve. Richard looked down at Lucius's arm and flinched. There was a mark there as well, but unlike his own tattoo of the caduceus symbol, meant to recognize his part in the medical field, this tattoo, well, almost like a brand, really, featured a sinister skull, the snake writhing about animatedly. He did not know what this thing was called, but it certainly gave an impression of evil. As he looked down at this mark, suddenly several puzzle pieces fell into place at once. Lucius's deference towards him, his desire to impress Richard and his family, his belief that Richard was a secret agent. He hadn't meant an agent of the Muggle military. He meant this one, Voldemort's army, and based on the fact that Lucius was marked this way, it meant that Lucius was part of that army. Richard could not tell the truth to this man. Hermione had impressed upon him the gravity of the situation between Voldemort and her friend Harry Potter. This dark wizard and all of his associates were dangerous. Luckily, they had no idea who they were dealing with. "Lucius, I need you to leave. I have a secret mission from—" "The Dark Lord has given you a secret mission?" There was a note of disbelief and jealousy in Lucius's voice. "Yes, it's from the Dark Lord." "What is it?" "I could tell you, but then I would have to kill you," Richard said smoothly. "Look, just
Meet me here next Wednesday night. Linda has yoga, let's say 7:20 at night. Come to the front door and knock, please. Don't just appear, yes? You scared the living daylights out of me. My apologies, Lord Granger," murmured Lucius with a small bow. Richard rolled his eyes as the wizard popped away. He couldn't decide if this was going to be the worst thing he'd ever done, or the funniest. He just needed to make sure it wasn't the last thing he ever did. He checked his watch. About 30 minutes before Linda would be coming home, ready to share with him all of the latest gossip and funny stories from her canasta night. Just enough time, then. He hurried down the basement steps and stood in front of the metal bookshelf that held boxes of old sporting equipment, camping gear, and trophies from their younger years. He squatted down and pushed aside the box of table tennis paddles, badminton gear, and bocce balls. He pulled a small paper clip from his pocket and inserted one pointed end of it carefully into a nearby imperceptible hole on the wall, behind where the box had sat, low to the ground by the baseboard. One of 2 electrical outlets nearby swung open, revealing a 10-digit keypad. Within a few months of them moving into this house, Linda had complained that this outlet did not work, so Richard had installed a second one next to it that would. Now, the family just treated this additional outlet as one of those strange quirks, a little eccentricity of electricity. If guests tried to plug anything into it, they were quick to tell them, "Oh, no, that one doesn't work. Try the one next to it." But it did work. Just not in the way that anyone but Richard knew about. He put in the 37-digit code that he knew from memory. Behind him, a click and a creak, as a series of high-strength magnetic locks released, and the shelf moved imperceptibly away from the wall behind it. Richard grasped the back edge of the bookcase and pulled, revealing a short, dark corridor. He stepped inside and pulled the door closed, mindful that none of the items on the shelf were disturbed. He flipped a light switch, and the room came into view. An array of weapons lined one wall, from floor to ceiling. A wardrobe filled with various suits, hairpieces, and shoes, as well as weather-dependent clothing like heavy-down parkas and waterproof boots, stood in one corner. One section was devoted entirely to scuba gear. A large shelf full of various gadgets sat along the back wall. On it were all manner of things: binoculars, listening devices disguised as packs of cigarettes, document scanning devices that looked like a tin of breath mints, GPS trackers disguised as sets of keys, eyeglasses with cameras at the temples, packets of gum with switchblades inside, flashbangs that looked like a tin of mints, night vision goggles, fountain pens with invisible ink, recording devices that looked like watches. Richard reached inside of a box on a shelf and withdrew a small mobile phone. After a second he thought better, and took another one. He did not want Lucius calling the house phone, or his regular mobile device. Next, he sat down in a leather chair at the desk in the center of the room. Opening a drawer full of paper clips, staples, and other supplies, he reached to the drawer's underside and pressed a discreet button with the pad of his forefinger. A disembodied female voice said, "Welcome." "Authorization 53 Whiskey Alpha Tango 79486 Oscar Kilo India Echo." There was a whirring, a series of calculating beeps, and then a chime. "Hello, Danger Mouse." It was a warmer human voice this time. "Hiya, Susan. I wonder if I could get you to get a message to Lobo for me." "Absolutely." "Tell him to meet me at Ethel's pub, near the bar, tomorrow, 10 o'clock. "I'll tell him." Thanks. Can you also put in a call to Wix? Ask them to get in touch." Wilco! Richard pressed the button again, and the connection cut out. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his forehead with the pads of his fingers. He hadn't had much of a desire to move in these circles any more. Anyone who mattered at MI6 nowadays knew that Danger Mouse had generally retired to the quiet civvy life. But when he was called in for special assignments, or, more rarely, when he called them, they always answered. A perk of being a top agent back in the day. He'd taken on a few short assignments for them in the last couple of years, nothing that took him away from home too long. He was always able to explain it away to Linda as his mother's cousin in Cardiff, needing some help repairing a chicken coop, or some other such nonsense. One previous time that he had needed to contact them was 4 years prior, when an unusually dressed woman had appeared on their doorstep with a letter for their daughter. His request at agency headquarters for more information on the subject evidently triggered a certain response, and a special agent got back in touch with him, someone that worked on both sides. On the MI6 side, she was known by the codename Wix. On the other side, she held a position called an aura. The person named Wix had arrived shortly at their house, and had confirmed what the professor had told them. Then she said that she had obliviated everyone who wasn't on a need-to-know basis. Essentially, everyone in the chain that linked them to her. He hadn't needed to contact them again until now. But now, he really needed them. "Good grief," he said to himself.
Chapter 15. Assemblies in Alcoves. The next evening, a Friday in late September, 1995. The first month of Hermione's 5th year had been rather uninspiring. The start of school was usually filled with excitement, even that first year when she had hardly known anyone. At least then she'd had new and different school subjects to look forward to learning. This year, so far, had had none of the excitement of the Triwizard Tournament, or the danger of Dementors. There was no mystery of strange voices and sinister messages in the corridors, no Death Day party, no midnight duels, no contraband dragons. In fact, it had hardly any excitement at all. Every bit of fun at Hogwarts was being sucked dry by the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Dolores Jane Umbridge had been ensconced at Hogwarts in part because the school had difficulty attracting talent for that subject. There were many that felt the position was cursed, and in part because lately Dumbledore had taken to telling anyone who would listen that Voldemort had returned. One person who was listening very carefully to what Dumbledore had to say was Harry Potter. Late in the night he came downstairs into the common room to talk to Hermione, occasionally bringing Ron with him. The three of them discussed all manner of things, from Umbridge's failings as a teacher to the dreams Harry often suffered. The dreams often featured Voldemort, and to Harry they felt premonitory and dangerous. Harry had spent his last days of summer at the house of his godfather, Sirius Black. There, he, along with Black and Lupin, had spent hours following the clues about Voldemort's and Peter's whereabouts. It had become an obsession for the three of them. Unfortunately, much of Harry's information was second-hand through Sirius and Remus. For whatever reason, Dumbledore was ignoring him, which really messed with Harry's head. Yes, he had lost the Triwizard Tournament, but did that mean that he was useless? Dumbledore seemed to think so, at least according to Harry. This seemed odd to Hermione. She would have thought, seeing as Harry had actually faced Voldemort, not just as a baby, but in his first and second years at school, that he would be one of the first to be read into the situation, if the situation were actually true. The Ministry was not interested in such nonsensical rumours. No, it much preferred to stick its head in the proverbial sand, and ignore the very idea. And so,
It laid an ostrich egg, dressed in a tacky pink cardigan, and wearing a ridiculous black bow in her hair. Dolores Umbridge seemed especially capable of getting under her student's skin. Her idea of defense against the dark arts was theoretical at best, and barely scratched the surface at that. By the time most students had read a few pages of each chapter, their brains had turned into a mushy mess of jargon and theory, resulting in a hodgepodge of impractical knowledge with no useful application in the real world. "We aren't learning anything in defense against the dark arts," Hermione complained to Draco and Pansy one evening in the library. The three of them were working on a group project for ancient runes. So far, Hermione had done about 70% of the work, whilst Draco had done 50%. Of their overlapping 20%, Pansy deemed Hermione's better, and Draco's was discarded. As for Pansy, she was finishing up the second coat on her fingernail polish. "Who cares? That's one less class we have to study for, then," Pansy said. "And it isn't like it matters that much. After all, when dark magic is used, we're going to have to rely on instinct, not necessarily book knowledge." Draco spoke over her. Hermione huffed. Draco knew that the idea of not relying on book knowledge was preposterous to the bookish Gryffindor. Pansy shifted her eyes sideways at Draco. "Right, yes." Draco knew that some of his fellow Slytherins had heard the whispers of the Dark Lord's imminent return, and whilst they may or may not be looking forward to it, they were treating it as an inevitability. Crabbe, Goyle, and Pusey planned to join up as soon as possible with the Dark Lord's army. Theo was already considering escaping to Ibiza this summer. Blaise was going to stay with his father's family in Italy if war broke out. Daphne and her sister Astoria were leaving for America with Miles and Margaret Bletchley. And as for Pansy, her plan was to simply sit back and let everyone else fight over it. Like a cat with 9 lives, she would land on her feet, whoever was in power. And Draco? The truth was, he had no idea. He knew where Hermione's heart lay. Regardless of what Lucius believed, she wasn't an agent of the Dark Lord. That much was clear. Had she wanted to kill Potter, she'd had ample opportunities over the years. But if Hermione were presented as a pureblood, and they could get married after school was finished, would it be so awful having to live under Voldemort's thumb? They could go away to France, perhaps stay there. Draco had enough money to make that happen. If there was a second Wizarding War, it wouldn't need to affect them. But on days like this, he could see the fire in her copper eyes. He could feel the intensity of her courage coming through her words. It made his stomach churn, and his heart race, and his blood run cold with thrill and fear. Because if she followed the path of Potter and Dumbledore, and all the while he was duty-bound to follow the ways of the Malfoys before him, what would that mean for the two of them? Walking Hermione back to the Gryffindor common room, Draco asked, "What's your plan, with Umbridge?" "What do you mean?" Hermione feigned innocence. "Come off it, witch. I've known you too long. I know your big brain is working on some kind of solution to that problem you mentioned." Hermione raised an eyebrow at him. "Well, shows what you know." Her steps faltered as the truth emerged. "I really don't have a good solution. I mean, what can a bunch of underage wizards do against a professor? And a ministry official at that? I mean, she has all the power here." There were a handful of Gryffindors returning from dinner further up the corridor. Draco pulled her into a nearby alcove for privacy, dropping their book bags and leaning against the wall. He pulled her into his arms, linking his fingers behind the small of her back. Pressed against him, Her body felt so warm and alive. "Hermione, if there's one thing I've learned about you, it's that if you want the power, you can take it any time," he murmured. He smiled lazily at her, looking at the adorable Cupid's bow of her pink lips. They looked so soft, so kissable. Her lovely copper eyes, framed in thick lashes, blinked slowly at him, mesmerized, as he moved closer. Their lips met, and Hermione sighed at the contact. Draco's hands flattened against her back, kneading her waist gently. He pulled her closer, closer to him, until she was standing between his legs. Her long hair, falling down her back, tickled against his hands as he held her. The softness and warmth of her skin through her blouse felt like molten silk beneath his fingers. He pulled away to look at her gorgeous face, catching sight of the sparkle in her copper eyes. He surged forwards to kiss her again with a growl, his hands buried in the tumultuous hair at the nape of her neck. "Mr. Malfoy, Miss Granger, when you're done inspecting that alcove for loitering students, please finish your prefect rounds and go to your respective common rooms." The low voice of Professor Snape drawled, only feet away, on the other side of the tapestry from them. Hermione startled and nearly shrieked at the first words, but Draco managed to clamp a hand over her mouth just in time. She cut her eyes sideways at him. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. She nodded slightly, and he moved his hand. "Yes, Professor." Draco called smoothly, and there was a swish of fabric as the potions master moved off. "Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness! I can't believe it!" Hermione Whisper shouted. She wrung her hands, panicked. "Do you think we're going to be in trouble? Oh my goodness! We're going to be in so much trouble!" "Hermione, calm down." He laughed quietly. "Snape catches Blaise and Daphne about 5 times a week, and Theo and whomever he's snogging this week even more than that. You won't get detention or docked house points if that's what you're worried about." "You're sure?" She looked up pleadingly, with her huge copper eyes, freckles along the bridge of her nose standing out in sharp relief from her suddenly pale skin. He smiled and kissed her on the forehead. She was so beautiful, so ardent and impassioned. He loved that. He loved her. He stood, stock still, falling slightly against the wall, eyes widened as he stared at her. He had not realized it before, but yes, he did love her. Oh, holy hell. He'd had no idea. Hermione only looked at him quizzically as he stood there, leaned against the wall of the alcove. "Are you all right?" Yes." "Well, I'm going to go ahead, so we aren't seen leaving at the same time." And with that, Hermione rushed to him, cupping his face in both hands, and kissing him once more. He grabbed her, as if to pick up where they left off at Snape's untimely arrival, but she pulled away. "Bye." He raised his hand in farewell, but she was already through the tapestry. He fell against the wall, his hand finding his forehead and rubbing. How had this happened? With everything else going on, with the looming fear of the Dark Lord's return, and Professor Umbridge's moronic decrees, he'd fallen in love. Somehow, his feet carried him down the several flights of stairs to the dungeon without the need for his brain to engage. When he finally reached his dormitory, 10 minutes later, Blaise gestured to his bed. "Your parents' owl brought a note. He's a real asshole, you know." "Yeah, Colwyn's personality leaves a lot to be desired," Draco agreed. He picked up the note to read. "D. He has returned. Richard and I met him at his ancestral home. Richard has a secret mission from him. I do not know what it is, but be cautious. It may involve Hermione. Stay alert, and stay out of her way. Assist her, if you are able. L.A.M.
Draco read the note 3 times through, then leaned over the side of his bed and, to the surprise and disgust of his assembled roommates, vomited onto the floor. Soft organ music suffused the frankincense-scented air. The lighting was dim, purposefully. Clusters of dozens of candles were lit at intervals, set into red and white votive cups, giving the space an ethereal glow. The overall mood was mellow and reverent, but Richard was watchful. Despite his seemingly affable, mild-mannered demeanor, Richard could not enter a room without assessing threats, locating all exit points, checking the area for potential surveillance. He had been taught this in his time with the various military organizations he had served in, both those listed on the British Army rosters and those that were not. A person could very well turn off the intuition once he had moved into the private sector of dentistry. Now, however, after quickly and quietly analyzing, memorizing, and cataloguing faces that he met, he also looked at people's teeth. For instance, the priest who was milling about, straightening the cloths on the high altar of St. Etheldreda's Roman Catholic Church, had a serious case of overcrowding. His teeth jumbled together like the pool pile in a game of dominoes. Richard shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Lobo needed to hurry. Even though he was facing the main church exit, Richard knew there was a seldom-used entrance behind him in the sacristy, and it made him nervous to have his back to it. It was true, someone would need to jump a very tall wall to get into the courtyard, but ever since last Wednesday night, Richard wouldn't put anything past anyone any more. The door to the church swung open, flooding the large church briefly with bright daylight. The couple of elderly ladies on a nearby pew turned to see what new Lamb of God, and/or sheep of gossip, was arriving. Seeing only a man in his late 30s or early 40s, they turned back to their whispered conversation. Lobo sighted Richard and walked with a loping grace up the center aisle, head held high, knowing Richard had already assessed and neutralized any threats that theoretically existed in the church. There had been none. He sat on the left end of a pew, halfway up the aisle, 20 feet or so from Richard. After a minute, Richard finished his unspoken prayer and crossed himself, turning and walking along the side aisle of the church, to the north transept. 2 minutes later, Lobo followed. "I need you to look into some people for me. Here's a list." Richard shoved a small slip of paper into Lobo's hand. "I may not have gotten all the names right." "You've always been shite with names,"
Lobo murmured. "Yeah, so try variations. Anyway, there's a kingpin. I don't know his real name, but he goes by Voldemort."
Lobo's blue eyes flashed up at Richard's hazel ones. "Did you say Voldemort?"
"Yes."
Lobo looked around, assuring himself once more that they were alone. "I think you need to speak with someone else. Have you ever been in contact with an agent named Wicks?" At this, Lobo looked appraisingly, curiously at Richard, as though they'd never met. That was odd, Richard thought, seeing as they'd worked together on several missions over the years. But Richard was on guard as well.
"Yes, we've spoken."
"How?"
This one word was said with such confusion and disbelief, and it made Richard a bit paranoid. Lobo likely had no reason to speak with Wicks. to even know of her existence. So how did he know of it? Richard had known Lobo for years, ever since Lobo had been assigned to his team as a junior agent. They had served on missions together, and Richard trusted the man's unparalleled instinct and sense of timing without question. And yet, he didn't even know the man's real name, or what he did when he wasn't acting as a secret agent in Her Majesty's service. The same was true of Richard's identity to Lobo. Lobo only knew him as Danger Mouse. It wasn't as if they hung out, grabbed beers together at weekends. They worked together on a brief mission as needed, then parted ways until the agency paired them up again. Richard took his time in answering. "I spoke with Wicks a few years ago to confirm the existence of a group of people living in the shadows of society." "And you have retained your memories of this conversation, of these people?" Richard narrowed his eyes at Lobo. The man was asking why he had not been obliviated, which he gathered was the standard procedure if a non-magical person with no relation to the wizarding world encountered magic. "No, I have a family tie to the community." Lobo gasped. He looked quickly to his right to confirm that no one was watching, then reached into the lapel of his coat. Richard, out of instinct rather than mistrust, did the same, his fingers inching towards the butt of the small revolver in his holster. "I'm not drawing a weapon on you," Lobo said quietly. But he did remove a long, thin bit of twig from his pocket. Richard's eyes widened as the man moved the twig, and a feeling like an invisible wet blanket fell over the air. Lobo took Richard by the arm and spun on the spot. As they disappeared, the votive candles flickered in the whirl of suddenly displaced air.
Thank you for listening to The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great78. If you enjoyed this and would like to listen to more, please subscribe to me on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts at Silver and Copper, or search Great78 on Archive of Our Own.